had another sermon written for this morning about giving. You all know that we're making our estimates of giving this morning. We've been thinking about the coming year in our congregation, and today we're offering the ways in which we'll support this ministry that we all care about so much. It was a little bit of a stretch to write a sermon about giving to the church using Mark's picture of Jesus glaring at the temple and talking about how it was destined for the ash heap, but I was most of the way through. But afterward, when the news from Paris came on Saturday morning, I knew the old sermon had to go. And I also knew that Jesus' frightening words didn't sound so far off the mark anymore. It's not that horrific and senseless violence isn't happening elsewhere in the world, in Syria, in Beirut, and any number of other places. But when it strikes so close to the place that we all call home right now, it does resonate in a different way. The ground beneath our feet shakes a little bit. In that reading we heard from Mark's Gospel, Jesus describes a world that is too familiar. A world where things that look as big and unshakable as a temple, things like a calm night in a peaceful city, can in fact turn to rubble. A world scarred with wars and rumors of wars, where nation is indeed rising up against nation. A world of real and metaphorical earthquakes and of very real famines. A world where many claim to have answers to all of this. More walls, more fear, more demonization of others. A world where many lead people astray. Jesus says all of that. He describes a world that we can see around us, and I think in a week like this, that we can feel in our guts as well. Sometimes we think of apocalyptic literature as being particularly strange. I actually wish this text sounded stranger than it does. And that's not exactly anything new, because the world that's described in this passage isn't so far from the world that Jesus' disciples knew at this point in the story, here in the last week of Jesus' life. They knew a world where the ground beneath their feet was also beginning to shake, and where the one who represented for them something like the temple, this human being who fully embodied God's presence on earth, was in fact about to be thrown down, stone by stone. The world described in this passage also isn't so far from the world that Mark's audience would have known. Scholars will remind us that the immense temple in Jerusalem did in fact come tumbling down. It was destroyed by the Romans 30-some years after Jesus' life, in the year 70, which scholars think is just about the year that the Gospel of Mark was written. As Mark wrote, and as his audience listened, not one stone was left on another. Nation was rising up against nation. There were wars and rumors of wars. The diaspora began. And of course, Christians were largely a part of the Jewish community at this time, so Mark's community shared in that experience. Maybe because of its future tense language, Jesus' description of this torn apart world has often sounded to the church like fortune telling. Or worse, like some horrible grocery list that when completed will mean the world is finally checking out. You have probably all seen somebody toting out a passage from Revelation or Mark chapter 13 when something terrible is happening and announcing with this strange mixture of fear and pleasure that this is finally it. The list is finally getting all checked off, so we better be ready to check out. The problem with all of that, of course, is that the list has undoubtedly been checked off countless times already. It could have been perfectly well completed in the first century, and here we are, all these millennia later, still wincing a little bit at just how closely Jesus' picture fits our world today. So I don't think Jesus is particularly interested in fortune-telling. In fact, he says it as plainly and simply and emphatically as possible. But about the day or the hour, no one knows. Neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Not even he knows, he says. Jesus has never much seemed in the fortune-telling business, in fact. In his teaching and his healing and his preaching and his feeding, in the way that he spent the bulk of his time, he's always been interested in what it means to live as God's presence and to embody God's kingdom here and now. So I think this is how we should be reading his description of the world in Mark 13. It's not a code to search and crack or a grim prediction of the last days. I really think it's meant to describe the world that people of faith live in and must continue in. Which, of course, still leaves you with plenty of options. If the world we live in is a place with wars and rumors of wars and famine and great stones that come tumbling down, then we can certainly choose to hole up and keep to ourselves. If the world is such a dangerous and uncertain place, we can very well listen to all the voices that aim to whip up fear right now and claim the only answer is self-protection, taking care of me and my own. We can allow ourselves to grow cynical and defeatist and give up on the whole thing. Or we can listen to the words of the book of Hebrews we heard this morning, which sound especially beautiful to me today. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for the one who has promised is faithful. We can listen to those words and we can follow their lead. We can persevere. We don't know much about the circumstances of the letter to the Hebrews, but it's clear from the letter itself that this community knew a thing or two about the uncertainty of life. The writer lifts up the example of Christ as one who also suffered hostility. He counsels them to endure trials, to lift up their drooping heads, to strengthen their weak knees. He reminds them that faith is always the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And in our reading this morning, he calls them simply to keep going. And if you ask me, I think this is what all that crumbling apocalyptic imagery in Mark means to do for us, to remind us that even in times such as these, the call of faith is always to persevere. Hebrews says it so beautifully. For he who has promised is faithful. And let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. If it feels like things are fragile around us, the faithful response is not to panic, not to turn inward, not to turn back, but to persevere, to meet together all the more joyfully, to encourage one another all the more openly, to love all the more deeply. That is a much better Giving Sunday message than I had come up with anyway. On a day when we are so aware of the fragility of life, let's encourage one another to do what really matters, to cherish the message of grace and hope that's been entrusted to us, to be God's people in this place, to give generously to a mission that we believe in, to practice offering welcome with a renewed sense of just how precious it is, to tell a story of reconciliation that the world so desperately needs. Last Sunday, we held a meeting after worship to talk about opening our doors here for an English cafe, a time to host local migrants and refugees and others who are simply looking for a cup of tea and somebody to listen to them. A few of us have been working on that idea for a while, and we had no idea what to expect. But the response was tremendous. I'd never thought we'd be able to settle on a time for the cafe, but as soon as we said who could do a Tuesday, 10 hands were in the air. This past week, the worship committee gathered to listen to the texts for Advent and to plan for creative, faithful, and vibrant ways to bring them alive in worship this year. Right now, members are upstairs spending time with our congregation's children, teaching them stories of love, cracking open this rich faith for them. Later today, members of our congregation and the German-speaking congregation will be headed to the Paki for an interreligious rally. Our brass group will be joining in and celebrating the many traditions of faith we have here in Geneva, along with Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, and other communities. This evening, newcomers and members will be gathering for a meal and a time of Bible study, sharing their experiences of faith and their journeys. This is simply what Christian faith looks like when the seas are calm and when they are rough. In a time of upheavals, of wars, and rumors of wars, this is exactly what we should be doing. Living our faith, cherishing what is truly important, offering ourselves and all that we have, being the people of hope that Jesus' followers have always been called to be. Amen.